This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 242 of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm Jamie Bogner. We are in Paso Robles, California today, out here for the Firestone Walker Invitational Beer Festival, one of my absolute favorite beer festivals of the entire year. And joining me is Jos Ruffell of Garage Project. Welcome to the podcast, Jos.
Thank you, Jamie. Great to be here.
And when I say Garage Project, I should also mention creator of Phantasm, a very hot product right now, and also someone who works very closely with New Zealand hop growers. You make the trip out here every year for the Firestone Walker Invitational, as you have since 2014. Clearly, it's a fun one for you all, too.
Yeah, it's fantastic to be back. It's great to see the festival on again. You know, we all had a couple of years on the bench, but we're back. So yeah, it was an absolute no-brainer to get back on the plane and make the hike, the pilgrimage back to Paso and pour at the festival.
And you always make a great show of it, and the crowds respond to it in kind out here. I can't wait to see what you have concocted for this year's festival. In this episode, like I said, we're going to talk about hops. We will talk about Phantasm. We will talk about thiols. We'll talk about that origin of that, especially when it comes to New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc grapes, a wine style that I absolutely love coming out of New Zealand. And you've been able to find a way to synthesize those flavors that are so common in wine, through the hops and the terroir of New Zealand, as well as now pulling in product of Phantasm that uses that grape as well in a different kind of way. Thiols, they're so big right now. Everybody's talking about thiols, and we're going to talk about thiols some more on this episode. But first, what if you could chill your beer with a more efficient chiller? The answer, G&D Chiller's new micro-channel condensers. G&D's micro-channel condensers are highly efficient in hotter regions, use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers, which provides less opportunity for leaks, along with lower global warming potential. G&D Chiller's engineers are committed to green technology design while developing a more efficient chiller for the brewing industry. Contact G&D Chillers today at gdchillers.com. Also, support for this episode comes from Hop Solutions by BSG. The Hop Solutions portfolio is a joint effort between the brewers, hop specialists, and brewing scientists of BSG and the RAR Technical Center that takes a flavor-first, application-specific approach to hops. Whether you're seeking biotransformation in a juicy IPA or dialing in a classic West Coast profile, BSG has a hop solution for that. Get in touch with the hop nerds at BSG by emailing letstalkhops@bsgcraft.com for samples, spots, and contracts. Like I said, we're going to talk about thiols. We've had some conversations in the past. I vaguely remember we're on probably 2015, 2016, back when we used to drive our giant RV out here with the Craft Beer and Brewing brand on the side. And I swear, I think Gordon Shuck was involved in that conversation. I have a very vague memory of it because that's how the evening conversations at the Brewers Camp here at the Firestone Walker Invitational tend to go. But Jos, give me some of your background. Walk me through that arc that you took through craft beer and what took you to the point of starting a brewery, and then how has that progressed then over the last few years?
Yeah, so I started out with that classic Epiphany pint. I used to work in a completely different industry. I used to work in video games, game development, and the studio I was with in Wellington, we used to do a lot of business in America. So I'd come up to California, LA, San Francisco, and I got handed that pint of Pliny the Elder, and it just...
Pliny the Elder, that was the beer.
Yeah, and It just blew my mind, and it sort of set me off on a trajectory of being basically a big beer geek.
Sure.
Bringing as many of those great sort of West Coast beers back to New Zealand as I could, and then bringing some classic New Zealand style pilsners in exchange. And I just sort of went on that trajectory, and just in a twist of fate, my best friend Ian, his older brother Pete, had been brewing professionally for 10 years. He was trying to set up his own brewery in Australia, and struggling to get through the New South Wales government bureaucracy at the time. He's an incredibly intelligent guy, and he could not get past that barrier at the time. I was looking to do something different, loved beer, and Wellington has always been a really big craft beer capital for New Zealand. It's really had a strong, avid sort of craft beer community. But at the time, in 2010, we weren't brewing any beer in Wellington. We were drinking a huge amount of it, but we weren't brewing a single drop of it. And it sort of just seemed like a great opportunity. It was either a great opportunity or everyone knew something that we didn't. And, we're about to make a terrible mistake. But Pete came over to Wellington, checked it out. His family was already in New Zealand. And we decided, we'd set up a brewery together. He quit his job, sold his house, and suddenly it became very real. We didn't have a huge amount of cash when we started, but we wanted to do something different. So we set up in an old petrol station in the heart of Wellington. We wanted the brewery to be a place that people could come and see, not be tucked away in an industrial estate. Right. And, we couldn't afford a proper brewery. We didn't want to compromise. So we made the decision that we'd start on a comically small system, but would use that to take risks, So we started on a Sabco half barrel brew magic. Sure. And we started under a thing we called 24-24. So we started brewing and releasing 24 different beers in 24 weeks. Which, today that would be like par for the course.
It would be kind of small compared to some brewers' schedules, right?
But, in 2011 at the time, it was different. And
I hope to God you could sell more than a half barrel of beer every week.
That's right. So, and it allowed us to take risks that we wouldn't. If we're making, 10, 20 barrel batches.
Sure.
So we really, we started with some
I hear
quite
that.
unique
It's
beers.
a common story, like, the Aslan folks from Virginia, same kind of thing, 2-barrel system. No one, burial, same kind of story. Like, no one would go back and do it that way again today.
Yeah. But
it certainly did benefit them at the time, given the circumstances.
Absolutely. And, we could have started contract brewing day one. But it allowed us to take a different path. And I guess for me, coming from a video games background, I would have called it rapid iteration prototype testing. It's like find the fun in a low risk environment, because if it's not fun and with crappy graphics, it's not going to be fun when it's like fully polished. You can't polish a turd.
Right.
But same for beer, right? If you can't make phenomenal, interesting beers at half barrel, well, what's going to happen when it's at 20 barrels? And that was our start. That was our genesis. And we wouldn't change it for the world. It sort of really set the trajectory and the pace for Garage Project. It's progressive, relentless, trying to push the boundaries wherever we could.
So then what did that arc from 2010 on look like? I imagine you took some bigger steps shortly after that to kind of scale up to meet demand.
Yeah. So we got to the end of 2011. We had a great following sort of getting established. We had absolutely no money, because you can't make money selling, a half barrel a week. And at that stage,
you were stashing all that profit away to make the next giant capital investment.
Exactly.
No. But you had a proof of concept at least.
Exactly. And we had a location. So we did a small, friends, family and fools sort of fundraising round, pulled together enough money to get a premier stainless 10-barrel system, 5 20-barrel fermenters, and a little Maheen, and away we went. And the brewery's just growing sort of organically out of that. We now have that same Arrow Street site. We swapped out the 10-barrel for a 20-barrel system. We put in some 40 and 60-barrel tanks. We built out the back and craned in some 100-barrel fermenters. Built out a much larger sort of cellar than you'd normally see, just from the constraint of our site. So we've got a lot of brights. And that site can package out at its peak. We did over 10,000 barrels out of it on this tiny little site.
Yeah.
We have a mixed fermentation site in the heart of Wellington, with full cool ship, fooders, a lot of punch-ins. We do full spontaneous beer out of there. A lot of sort of spontaneously fermented New Zealand wildflower-based wild ferment beers. And then we have a partnership brewery, a contract facility in the Hawke's Bay that we don't own, but we sort of helped establish, which is a 50 hectoliter Crohn's full turnkey production brewery. And our larger sort of volume beers are all brewed out of that brewery now as well.
Cool. So nowadays, how much beer do you put out there and sell in the market in a given year?
We're sort of like a shy under 30,000 barrels.
Well, I want to talk about some of the experimentation that you've done over that time. Certainly, you're known for dramatic, creative beers. But I think what's really interesting, especially for our audience, this New Zealand is a hub of flavor-focused ingredients for brewers around the world, finding new options and flavors with hops and finding new options now, of course, with Phantasm, finding ways to optimize for those styles is interesting. And you guys have certainly been on the forefront, the front lines, pushing that and working on that kind of experimentation. I want to talk about that, but first, are you looking for innovation in your next beverage breakthrough? Think outside the puree box and let your brand stand out with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Even smoothie seltzers can benefit from the extra boost of flavor and color. Old Orchard is based in the greater Grand Rapids, Michigan area, also known as Beer City, USA, and supplies craft beverage categories ranging from beer, wine, and cider to seltzers, spirits, and kombucha. To join the core of Old Orchard's brewing community, learn more at oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, Arrived mobile point of sale powers places with personality. Arrived is streamlining business operations for the makers of craft with an all-in-one solution that was built with love by hospitality professionals. No contracts and no monthly fees make Arrived a no-brainer for your craft business. Go to arrived.com/CBB to set up a free customized demo. That's Arrived, ARRYVED.com/CBB. A different kind of POS has arrived. So let's talk about some of those this kind of evolution of New Zealand hops. I know my timeline is a little rough, but we're really talking about no more than 10 years or so of impact of New Zealand hops on this broader world of brewing. Certainly the farms, as they got started, were, I imagine, struggling just to keep up with domestic demand, in those earliest days. But talk to me about how you've worked in that sphere using New Zealand hops, but also helping not just brewers, but also growers understand how to select and move flavor in these hops to something in a way that is favorable and pleasant and desirable, for brewers to use.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the industry in New Zealand has a long, proud tradition, great history. And if you look at the work that, like scientists like Ron Beatson did with his breeding program, he was really ahead of the curve of breeding hops for aroma and flavor, not just bitterness. If you look at hops like Nelson Sauvin, they were first crossed, a long time ago. He really was sort of leading the way. I think the industry went through a stage where
they were there, but there just wasn't a demand for it or an understanding that this even existed and could have been bred up for people.
Right. And I think, they also had, it's a grower owned co-op model at the time. And, they had a strong reliance on multinational breweries and large contracts. And, I think they had some very exciting hops and they didn't quite know what to do with them. They went through a rebranding phase, which was fantastic. Motueka was not known as Motueka when it was released. It was like Sarts B or Sarts D.
Sure.
Not many people know that.
Right.
Doug Donnellan, the head of NZ Hops at the time, did a great job sort of rebranding and bringing these traditional names, these Maori names, to the hops of the places where they're growing. Riwaka and Motueka. Brilliant. We sort of got engaged with hops as a brewer, being based in Wellington. We're a very short flight from Nelson. The plane basically takes off and then lands immediately. How could we not want to get involved and sort of have that connection? I think of it like a chef. It's almost like unimaginable for a top chef to rely on ingredients to turn up in a box from God knows where and have no input or knowledge of like how they were grown or picked or harvested and that happens all the time for us, unfortunately, as an industry. But, we had that proximity, and access was limited and it was hard, going back a number of years. And, we fortuitously won a trophy at the New Zealand Brewer Guild Awards, and Plant and Food Research sponsored it, and Ron presented it to us and came with the promise of a tour of their facility, and that sort of set us off on our journey of sort of understanding that there were a lot more experimental hops that they weren't necessarily getting brewer feedback on, that they weren't necessarily getting that interaction. It was at the time, very sensory led. It wasn't being, brew trial led, and understanding what was happening in the fermentation. And it sort of just created a pathway for us to sort of start engaging more directly with farms. And around that same time, we formed a relationship with Freestyle. And so we had a new owner come in and buy a farm in New Zealand that was independent. They wanted to move outside of the co-op model, which was, I think challenging for a lot of people at the time. But, they had a clear vision of wanting to grow and sort of produce excellent hops for the world's sort of best craft brewers. And it was something we could really get behind. We could have full access to lot selection. We could understand, give input to how the hops were being grown, harvested. And, they brought on their own palletizing, so we could actually have input onto how it was, palletized as well. And that was really a game changer. And, I think the industry now is vastly different to what it was even a handful of years ago. You have a number of independent farms, be it Freestyle, Hop Revolution, Clayton's. There's a number of options sort of alongside New Zealand hops who have really, carried on their tradition. They've released Nectaron, new varieties.
Right.
They're sort of, I think, I think sometimes competition is healthy. It really sort of helps sort of lift everyone's game. So it's an exciting time for the industry. Our involvement.
That kind of transparency and that working hand in hand with brewers is also a reason why more and more brewers are interested with New Zealand hops compared to the hops that are coming from another large continent close by down there.
That's right.
Which has a much more opaque process around that kind of thing.
I mean, for us, I think we've seen what's possible really led out of Yakima. I think it's phenomenal, the work. We see YCH giving such direct feedback to their growers and creating such a positive feedback loop. And, we want to sort of emulate that down in New Zealand and give people that access. Our role in it is at Garage Project, we're the co-founders of Hapi Research with Freestyle, which is a large New Zealand government-backed program. It's multi-year. It's a $12 million project with a huge portion of government funding behind it to sort of bring transformational growth to the New Zealand hop industry. And that sort of gives us a wide range of tools. Like Freestyle can do a lot of on-farm research about sustainable practices for strings, for training the hops through to picking windows or fertigation or drying windows. We can do brewing trials. Within that, we have multiple breeding programs underway, and then a sort of a remit to help sort of grow and sort of encourage new growing regions in New Zealand. So we're starting to see farms emerging outside of the typical Nelson catchment. We've got a new farm going in the Nelson Lakes region, which is about 2 hours south of Nelson. But very exciting, very promising to see new appellations, new terroir coming available alongside the new hop varieties coming through. So, it's just a really, really interesting, energetic sort of moment for the industry. And this coming harvest is the first time, we've got our borders open as well. So, I think, in Fortress New Zealand, there's a lot of things that have been happening quietly over the last 2 years, and we can sort of share them this coming harvest in March. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah. Let's talk about, some of those flavor-based projects. Certainly over when the first time, if I'm thinking about my first experience with a hop like Nelson, it was probably through Alpine beers, West Coast IPA, Nelson. And, that was the context at the time. It was very much West Coast IPA based. And then this crazy thing happened in the world of beer, 2014, 2015, 2016, and all of a sudden hazy and juicy IPA, where it could be sweeter, heavier, thicker, more body, and also more intense hop flavor to balance that out. became a thing. And it seems like New Zealand hops were very particularly positioned at that time to provide a breadth, because now we're also talking about this world of beer that became a special double dry hops, add a whole new element, to these core beers. But talk to me about how you worked in collaboration with growers to think about these flavors and to find new ways to pull flavors through the brewing process, through the fermentation process, pleasurable flavors from those hops themselves that maybe, a few years prior brewers wouldn't have been as aware of were possible with those hops.
Yeah, I think starting with Alpine Nelson's a great shout. And Pat was just so ahead of the curve there, and not just, the fact that it's we call it Sauvin in New Zealand.
Okay.
We don't. I mean, Nelson's a town for us, so it's always quite funny when we come overseas and like, well, it's brewed with Nelson. In New Zealand would say that's a Sauvin.
That's all the hops are pretty much Nelson then. Yeah.
Sauvin beer.
Sauvin. Okay.
It's Nelson Sauvin. But one part of that beer, which is particularly interesting, is
it's like I'm saying, I brewed that with Yakima. Yeah. No, that wouldn't be right.
Well, that one interesting thing with that beer, and I guess to the point of sort of new hops coming along, that sometimes almost going back and looking at previous releases, Southern Cross is a hop that plays a big role, and as I understand in that beer, Southern Cross and Nelson, and it's a less glamorous hop, but it seems to be a hop that has a lot of very interesting compounds and components. You can look at some of Scott Janish's work looking at that hop in particular. That seems to be some very interesting synergistic effects that come along from the use of it, very high in like 2 MIB, sort of apricot flavors, and it seems to just really help amplify and sort of change hops. And as we're sort of starting to get more awareness of also the use of hops in different times of the process, Southern Cross maybe more on the hot side addition, I guess maybe analogous to sort of Idaho 7 or some of these sort of American varieties, we're starting to see more focus on sort of hot side additions. Mm-hmm. So I think not only do we have sort of interesting, exciting new varieties coming through from New Zealand, we have this great kind of pantry, this larder of existing varieties that we're sort of still wrapping our heads around and better understanding. I think we have a front row seat to sort of the work that Freestyle are doing. They're really pushing their picking windows. They're really exploring the sort of outer limits of what compounds they can actually extract out of, Nelson Sauvin or Motueka if they really sort of push those picking windows.
What is, from a sensory perspective, what would be the difference between early season, mid-season, late season Sauvin or Motueka?
I think it's like the full spectrum of sort of like citrus through to like very heavy tropical, and then if you push it too far, you get that sort of classic quote unquote dank.
Little onion and garlic and
But there's and I think this links back to thiols. There's a lot of free thiols and some bound thiols in New Zealand hops. I mean, that was the classic thing that sort of really piqued my interest about thiols back in the day, was sort of reading that Nelson Sauvin was obviously, it's a very sort of quote unquote white wine hop. It's named after Sauvignon Blanc. Nelson Sauvin, Sauvignon Blanc, contained thiols, and they didn't know why. If you look at a lot of Ron's work, he would sort of focus on the unknown compounds, and if you look at the unknown compounds as a percent of New Zealand hops, there's a staggering amount. There's a staggering amount. We just don't even know what they are or what they do.
Yeah.
And we're in this sort of interesting phase now where I guess the awareness and understanding around thiols has got to the point for on a hops front, farms like Freestyle are starting to actually really dial in, try to sort of grow, pick, dry and palletize and preserve those compounds, those very delicate, fragile compounds, in a way. And they're then testing and analyzing them, and one of the few laboratories in the world who can actually test for that, and seeing, discovering that they're getting shockingly high levels compared to what common wisdom, previous research has shown from other sort of grown lots in New Zealand that maybe weren't picked at the right moment, were dried too quickly or too high, maybe the pelletization was too hot, lots of reasons why those compounds might have disappeared. So, I think part of the conversation is like, what can we do to sort of like develop and release new varieties, but it's also what can we do with the existing varieties to actually sort of like dial them in and push them even further than what we've previously experienced from them.
Let's talk about Nelson Sauvin in a way that, or from a fermentation perspective. As you all started playing with that and working with it and trying to coax interesting results out of it in Motueka and Riwaka and others. Talk to me about some of the things that you found in using those. Certainly, we've been talking lately this year on the podcast with folks like Laura Burns or Ben from Surly. In particular, talking about how early fermentation, dry hopping during active fermentation is probably not creating additional haze components and maybe not doing some of the things that people thought it was doing. They've been focusing on mash hopping as a way to, again, set up these kind of thiol precursors to allow for, some of the yeast that they're developing to optimize that to pull those things out. But from a your standpoint, as you're working with Garage Project with New Zealand hops, what are some of the kind of fermentation parameters that you have found produce really pleasant results and things that drinkers are going to respond to in a more compelling way?
I think the sort of caveat there is that it's constantly evolving and changing.
Sure.
And
how has your process changed over the last 3 or 4 years then? Where were you and where do you find yourselves now?
Well, I think, and this is very, very much within Garage Project. This is Pete's domain. I think we've been on a real journey. The second or third beer we ever brewed in the 24 was Pernicious Weed, which it's a Nelson Sauvin and Rackau double dry hopped IPA, 8%, which we've brewed since 2011, and we still brew. We knock out 100 barrel tanks of that to this day, and that's sort of like our take on a West Coast sort of IPA with a New Zealand spin, and it's like very intense sort of grapefruit citrus. When you combine Nelson and Rackau together, they really play well together. And then I think as we sort of evolved into sort of the softer, more sort of expressive styles, East Coast, I think about a beer like Sunrise Valley, which we brewed in collaboration with JC at Trillium. And that's 100% dry hop beer, huge dry hop charge, nothing on the hot side. That's the number 1 rated beer in New Zealand on Untappd. And it's incredibly aromatic, and we brew it with fresh hops from the harvest. We've just released the 22 edition, and it's I think the work Freestyle have done has played a big role, and it's the best version of it to date. But if I think about what we're doing increasingly at the moment, as you say, it's switched back from that extreme of like all hops into the fermenter, no hot side, to layering in hops, looking for ways to sort of extract flavor and layer in those compounds into the wort stream all the way through. So thinking a bit more about mash hopping, what's going into the sort of the whirlpool, even exploring for some New Zealand hops in particular, what dip hopping or having a hop steep might bring to it, or sort of potentially volatilize off or remove, to sort of get to that point where it's just like that nice, potent, expressive tropical fruit flavor and aroma that we're searching for.
Sure. It is such an interesting thing about thiols that they are so low threshold, like that they are incredibly difficult to measure, and yet they also seem to have a hardiness, both a fragility and a hardiness that we're all trying to understand, that somehow they can make it through a boil, through a mash hopping process, or a hot side whirlpool kind of process. But in other ways, they tend to get worked out of that kind of, brew and not produce that kind of, piece? Are there some of those things that you'll have learned through this process, that help you kind of keep those things in the beer?
Yeah, I mean the thiols in the precursor form are really interesting, and they are, relatively speaking, quite stable. I think an interesting sort of way to think about that is, look at malt. We are becoming increasingly aware of the thiol potential, precursor potential on malt.
Sure.
And you think about how malt is handled. It's not, in a nitrogen flushed environment.
Right,
it's
right.
it's put through, probably quite a beating compared to hops in particular. They're sort of compounds that until the point of conversion, relatively speaking, they're stable. If we look at Phantasm, we do a huge amount at the point of harvest and a number of steps to sort of make sure we're sort of preserving them and capturing that precursor potential. Once we've got it processed into product, relatively speaking, it's quote unquote quite stable. We've seen from our very first trial batches of 2019 being put into beer even today in a recent trial, very high levels of precursor converting into free thiol. We look at temperature and degradation. If it sits at 20 degrees, it's quite happy. You're not going to see a huge degradation of precursor. It's only when you really sort of push it up to the sort of 60 plus degrees, you'll start losing them within hours. But it's quite fascinating. They're these quite mysterious compounds that we're still, learning a lot about every day. But, until the point of conversion, quite relatively speaking, quote unquote stable. And then as soon as they convert, they become extremely delicate.
Well, let's use that as a way to actually talk about what Phantasm is itself. But before we do that, from the rotatable pickup tube on Rogue Brewing's pilot brewhouse to the integrated hopbacks on Sierra Nevada's twin prototyping brewhouses, SS Brewtech has taken technology they invented, working with world-renowned industry veterans, and made them available to every craft brewer. To learn more about SS Brewtech's innovation list, head on over to ssbrewtech.com. So you mentioned Phantasm. Explain to me, if I were a layperson, what Phantasm is.
Phantasm is a natural thiol precursor product derived from Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc grape skins. It's a concentrated addition that you can put into your brewing stream that, under the right fermentation conditions, will unlock and give you a massive boost of free thiols, delivering high levels of 3SH, 3SHA. So, anything from sort of citrus, tropical, through to sort of like high passion fruit notes in your beer.
So basically, and you're not going to tell me what the exact process is, but you will dry and concentrate, and it comes in a powder form that you then add. How do you then use that through the brewing process?
So it's a powder that we recommend is dosed on the hot side.
Yeah.
And again, this is one of the sort of the surprising things. All through our trials, we expected Phantasm to be a cold side dry hop, dry hop product, and we saw some breweries as they do, just starting to like really push the boat out. And what happens if you use it in the mash? What happens if you use it in the hot side in the whirlpool? And we quickly saw in the whirlpool edition. You can add in the powder, you can load in those precursors to your wort stream, and then it's present at the start of fermentation. Thiols are typically formed within the first 24 hours of fermentation, so it's important to load those precursors in at the start. We do see breweries adding it cold side dry hop. You just need to have active yeast. It's critical.
Yeah. How does the yeast then take those precursors and turn them into thiols that our human sensory system can respond to?
Yeah, that's a question I'd throw to Laura over to make. I'm gonna take a hard pass on that.
Fair enough.
As I understand that, there needs to be an active gene, like an IRC7 gene, that can actually convert them in the sort of nitrogen-rich environment that beer has, compared to winemaking, typically low nitrogen environment. So we have a number of challenges to actually sort of convert them in the same way that you do in, say, a Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. But with these thiolized yeast strains, like Omega's Cosmic Punch or Star Party that have been released, they're sort of incredibly effective at that conversion process to take them from that bound state to a free thiol.
Talk to me a little bit about this, terroir similarity, between Marlborough Sauvignon and hops, and how this thiol piece relates between those. Because, just personally growing up, I shouldn't say growing up, my father in particular is a humongous Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc fan. Mm-hmm. We've been drinking lots of Marlborough Sauvignon Blancs for, 10, 15 years now. Mm-hmm. And I've always responded to the flavor because they had that kind of, kiwi, lychee, kind of green tropical fruit character to them that was really intriguing. And having drunk plenty of Sauvignon Blanc wines from other places, it didn't capture that same kind of like brightness and that green tropical fruit brightness. And it was fascinating to see that also could be captured through hops grown in a similar New Zealand terroir. You mentioned that we don't know exactly what that is, that the science isn't exactly there, but are there any kind of chemical continuities between those?
I think the thing which is just fascinating is we as a wine growing region in Marlborough, we have a number of wine growing regions throughout the country, and Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc is distinctive. If you took Gisborne Sauvignon Blanc or Queenstown Central Otago Sauvignon Blanc, they're nice. They just don't necessarily have that same intensity and pop that you get out of Marlborough. The region is very rich in these precursors and these thiol compounds, and as an industry, a lot of work has gone into understanding them and how to harness them and how to sort of really best utilize them. So as a starting point for Phantasm, there was this great bedrock of research and expertise around that sort of, the hunt for understanding the thiols. And it's really, it's a remarkable, there's aspects of what drives and increases thiol precursors, and it's a stress response from the plant that sort of releases them. That are perfectly suited for large-scale production. It was sort of like, the sort of dream scenario of the very sort of aspects of scaling up winemaking to a very large level, increase the amount of precursor and drive those characteristics.
In what way? Is it it has to do with irrigation? Does it have to do with picking time? What is the stressor there?
Machine harvesting.
Oh, machine harvesting.
Yeah. If you take Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc that's hand harvested, it has significantly lower levels of precursor than one that is machine harvested. So the very, very nature of sort of making your winemaker's job easier helps increase your product. And then there's a number of steps they'll go on along the way, but to get to that great end result. Why it sort of carries across to hops, as I said, we don't know. I think there's definitely probably something, my gut tells me, atmospheric. We have a giant hole in the ozone over New Zealand. We have a very high UV sort of level in the country. Maybe there's something in that. Who knows? But it is just this interesting quirk that we have.
When it comes to Phantasm as a product, do you work with specific wineries? I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you are using post-processing, skins product that is a byproduct of the winemaking process. But, as we know, oftentimes, even as it happens in brewing, you can do a fruit extraction or a fruit maceration on a beer and still have plenty of flavor left in those kinds of things. And fantastic that you might be able to, well, gosh, that was a terrible pun right there. But great. a very positive thing that you can pull something out of a waste stream and potentially find a new use for it that creates added value for brewers.
100%. So we work very closely with one winery in particular. We have another winery we've recently started working with this last season. We're really dialing in on known blocks that are like punchy, that are thiol bomb blocks as a starting point.
Thiol bomb blocks, yes.
As a starting point. It's very labor intensive. It's very sort of harvest critical. We're making sure we're capturing that mark, that material at very precise moments, times of the day, treating it in particular ways to ensure that we're sort of getting the optimal result. And then, otherwise that would have gone on the compost.
Yeah. And I imagine the winemakers don't hate working with you on this kind of thing.
They love it. They, as you know, it takes a lot of great beer to make good wine.
Sure.
We have a very sort of close working relationship. They're fascinated in what's happening in the brewing world. In some ways, we have no boundaries compared to wine, which is, really, really quite linear in what they can and can't do. I think it's just intriguing to see this sort of thiol discovery that we're starting, which they've been on for the last sort of 20 plus years. Yeah.
But at least they've got some research and some understanding that you can piggyback on and work with. So you say, as you're working on this, that it is not terribly temperature sensitive in the initial stages. And then if you store, it seems to store much like hops, where if you are keeping it, relatively cold or freezer temperature, that it doesn't degrade to a significant degree.
Absolutely. We've got forced aging trials underway that have sort of given us those early results, and then looking, it's relatively speaking such a new product. We don't just have the data on what it looks like 3-4 years out from where we are. But as I say, it's and this is the I think the exciting thing, and I always sort of say with Phantasm is it's a work in progress. This is experimental. This is an experimental product that you're brewing with. If you can get your hands on it, it's we want to gather in that feedback. We want to understand how you're learning about it, and it's been something that's evolved. Not just with Phantasm coming along, it's a product that was in development for a number of years. We released it in early 2020, and a few months later, alongside it came thiolized yeast. And it was just unbeknownst to us, unbeknownst to Omega, and Berkeley, and these companies working on these products. They were developing yeast to sort of really unlock thiol expression. We were developing a thiol precursor product.
So we're in this bigger, broader kind of public beta of Phantasm, if we want to call it that. We'll tie that back to your software roots there, where brewers are intrigued and interested in making products with it now all over the world. What has that learning from the brewing process fed back in and helped you all understand? Because, and that's one thing I find so interesting about this broader world of brewing that we're in. People do things, they try their own things, they make their own things, push this information back out to the manufacturers, the labs, producers, the agricultural side of the business that's creating these things. And, it's this beneficial loop that it helps everyone be able to guide everyone to make things better. Certainly there are brewers out there that have been finding new things with Phantasm, trying that in different styles of beer, using different kind of fermentation approaches there, different stylistic approaches. What are some of the more interesting ones that you've either been made aware of, or some of the learning from that process that's come back, that you've that's been intriguing even to you?
Yeah, I think that's the great thing with contemporary brewers is they're looking to break things. They're looking to sort of try something new, try something different. We're very clear with Phantasm that it's not a dry hop replacement, and the crew at Humblesea pretty much straight out of the gates came out with 100% Phantasm beer, which, as we, it had an incredible aroma, but it was sort of just a bit lacking in sort of flavor.
Yeah.
That was sort of, unique and exciting to see of just how far you can push it. We're seeing brewers just start to really think about how they load in a lot of precursor into that sort of wort production, mash hopping, Phantasm additions, other hop additions into the hot side. They'll unlock a huge amount of thiol flavor early in the fermentation, and then it's a real sort of challenge to keep it. So we know now that dry hopping can sort of interrupt and squish these sort of very delicate thiol aroma compounds. And so the race is on now that I see is sort of how to find a way to sort of make, I guess, monoterpene alcohols and sort of the compounds you're getting out of traditional dry hop live alongside and sort of work with thiols and not sort of like override each other. We know from looking at research that there's a really interesting sort of entourage effect between thiols and monoterpene alcohols. There's really interesting trials out showing, thiols by themselves maybe get an average rating in a sensory. Monoterpene alcohols by themselves got an average rating. You put the two together, and it was like by far the most preferred beer that was put forward in the trial. So I think.
Are there specific monoterpene alcohols that we're talking about here that heighten that kind of sensory? We've talked about the entourage effect, but it was with Keith Villa of Saria Beverage and Blue Moon, who was talking about that in purely a cannabis spectrum, where the same terpenes, have a similar entourage effect there. But, in here, are there specific, because now we're talking about potentially finding what you're talking about with something like Southern Cross that might potentially have a terpene content that might benefit the expression of some of these thiols. Are there some specific ones there?
We haven't.
How do we tie this all back together like that?
Yeah, I mean that's a level of trial brewing we haven't got to yet, but I think it's a fascinating one. One of the things I can share today, which is, I guess, an exclusive depending on when you release the podcast, we've collaborated with YCH on a Phantasm cryo blend. So I think boxes are just hitting brewers' doors now of a Citra Mosaic Simcoe cryo and Phantasm blend.
Interesting.
303 experimental blend, all in one. And we saw in the trial brews that the YCH undertook with that, the Phantasm by itself, the hops by itself, ratios of 20 and 40% Phantasm added. We saw Phantasm by itself would release, 1,400 nanograms per liter of 3SH. The hops by themselves release about 600, 700. You added 20% Phantasm to those same hops, and it released 1,600 nanograms per liter of 3SH. So just a tiny addition of those cysteine-bound precursors from Phantasm. I think that's the other thing to sort of keep in mind. We deliver a lot of cysteine-bound precursor versus glutathione, which is typically what you'll see in hops. They played together in a way that just a 20% addition, it was greater than the sum of the parts. I think that's really exciting. I don't see Phantasm as a dry hop replacement. It's sort of, talk about it like the MSG of beer. It's just like add a little bit, and it's just
right.
It's just giving you that pop. As Laura will sort of say from Omega, it's just kind of safeguarding or ensuring that you're just getting this background wash of free thiols to then sort of like work your hops in amongst and around.
Sure. Maybe we won't call it MSG because that's loaded with a whole bunch of other baggage.
MSG is delicious. I'll fight anyone who says otherwise.
Oh, well, that's been a lot of thiol talk. Let's, as we get on here, let's talk a little bit about some of the, other creative brewing approaches that Garage Project has taken and some of the interesting, maybe we can talk about your dramatic visual and layered approach to pouring special beers out here at a place like Firestone Walker. One of the things that we've been interested and intrigued by over the last couple years are brewers playing not just with the idea of flavor, not just with the idea of visuals, but also the idea of texture and time. And I think that the way that you all have been thinking about some of these brewing experiments plays in all of those things. That time, as we used to think about it in terms of beer, meant nice lacing on a glass that reminded you of each sip that you took, or something becoming more expressive as it warms. That's an easy way to think about time. But time, especially as you start thinking, and texture, as you start thinking about incorporating other textures. Now, certainly with hazy IPA, we think about texture and we describe beers as chewy in a way that we might not have in the past, or might not have meant the exact same thing in the past. But as you all are now doing it, especially using freezing or slushy kind of approaches to this, and building multi-layered pours that interact and change over time, it's a very different way even of thinking about how the flavor experience, but also the textural experience and the temperature experience shifts as somebody drinks it. Talk to me about the kind of creative process behind this, and how you all think and approach these things.
Yeah,
we're going to give a lot of creative credence to you making slushy beers that you pour at festivals, and we're going to dive into the whys and hows. I love it.
I think for us, where this really came from is, in New Zealand and Wellington, we have Beervana, which is the largest beer festival in New Zealand. And beer festivals in New Zealand and Australia are quite different to what we've sort of become, we've been able to experience up here in America. And I guess the main difference is they're really expensive. So, we don't have the free pour system. You buy a ticket to go into the festival and you get your glass, and then you got to buy tokens and actually buy every single beer or pour that you get. And I guess it came from me maybe just being frustrated when I was attending these festivals before we even had the brewery, was, a lot of breweries would just turn up with their regular core range beer, and you'd pay festival prices on top of a ticket to sort of have something you could go and buy in the bottle shop or the supermarket for a fraction of the price. So we really sort of took it upon ourselves that if we're going to turn up to a festival, we have to bring all new beer. And also, when you think about it, if you're buying a ticket to a festival, then we have to put on a show. You buy a ticket, we put on a show. And that sort of was really sort of the genesis behind thinking about how we could sort of pour and serve beers in different ways. And I think some of them are going back to very sort of traditional methods and sort of traditions. So, I think one of the things we're sort of known for is our hot poker, and, developing that sort of classic tradition of sort of taking a poker out of the fire and sort of muddling it into your mug of ale. Probably didn't take someone back in the day too long before sitting in front of the fire, looking at the poker, looking at their mug in front of them, and thinking, shit, I wonder what happens when I put that in there, and well, that's delicious. But we sort of worked hard to create a hot poker that we can sort of plug in and turn on demand. And for a festival, we can't have a raging fire and
right
pull it out. So how can we?
Insurers of these festivals frown upon that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's not looked on too kindly. And then it sort of sprung from there. We do the 2-tap flat white, and it was really this notion of New Zealand, I'm going to say, it's the home of the flat white. It's, we've got a proud coffee culture in Wellington in particular. And, it was like, how could we do a flat white beer? And we teamed up with a fantastic local roastery, Flight, and, they'd just won, Nick there just won like the Barista of the Year award in New Zealand. And so it was like, we just went in with a beginner's mindset of obviously we've all seen a flat white or a milk-based coffee being made a bazillion times, right? And it was like, make a coffee, tell us what you're doing.
Right.
And then it sort of just struck us as he was making it. It's like, flat white's two things. I mean, this is obviously sounds obvious saying this, right? It's espresso and steamed milk, So how can we make a flat white beer that's not two things? How can we make a flat white beer that's just a beer? Obviously it has to be two components. So that led to the process of making a incredibly rich, over-roasted coffee stout that's not designed to be drunk by itself. And then having the milk, and for us, that's a nitrogenated lactose cream ale with vanilla. And, we discovered that you can pour that out of a nitro tap into a milk jug. And at the moment of pouring it, it comes out jet white like milk. We overcarbonate the keg, and we can actually then pour it into the coffee as you would a barista and make even latte sort of foam art. And as you say, there's an interesting textural thing going on there. The layered beers we do, like Yuzu Rising Sun, that came out of our birthday celebrations and sort of looking at nostalgia. In New Zealand, we have this sort of chain of restaurants that's really kind of quite dinky, quite kitsch. And, everyone in New Zealand remembers growing up, going to this restaurant and having these traffic light layered soft drinks. And, we made a traffic light beer for our I think it was our 5th birthday. And, we had 3 distinct layers to this beer through density, which was phenomenal. But it was also a pain in the ass to do 3 layers. And so I think that Firestone Festival, we pared it back to just 2 layers and, yuzu, sour yuzu and raspberry. We've played around with foam, it's like restaurants and chefs, like foam. It's almost like its own cliche,
Yeah.
But, we sort of, approach that because we'd always turn up with a nitro keg to a festival and it would pour like shit, like it was, it's just like Murphy's Law, right?
Kegs pouring like shit at festivals is a pretty common occurrence.
Yeah, you're going to put the nitro beer on and it's a pain in the ass and it's just pouring foam. So we're like, well, what if we just made a beer that was designed to pour like shit?
Lean into it.
Yeah. And so, what would happen if we made like a chocolate raspberry beer foam, like a foamy beer that we could then layer onto a stout and it would drop into the beer and change the flavor of the beer as you were drinking it, as you're experiencing it. I think for us, it's just a lot of fun. And then, I think a serving technique is interesting because once you develop it, you can then apply it to other ingredients, other flavors. Ferran Adria, big hero of mine, chef from El Bulli, that was his modus operandi. He basically pioneered techniques, spherification, all these sorts of things, and then he could bring it to other flavors. And so I sort of think, the layered or the foam or, the two tap concept. How can we sort of then bring other flavors to it? That's really exciting. And
you build the technological framework for it, and then you extend that framework out to other executions.
Yeah. So we have custom. If you come by the booth tomorrow, you'll see we've got custom tap faucets that we've had engineered to help with that.
Custom tap faucets. What do they do?
They help with our layered beers. Basically, spread the beer out.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's built into the tap itself, so that you don't have to use a spoon or another spreading device to kind of slow it down.
Exactly. I mean, that's the great thing about a beer festival as well. You got to think about how you can bang these out.
Be efficient. You got a long line out there, right?
Yeah. I think one of the ones we did years ago was also we did a tap blender. We had the custom built faucet that sort of like connected 2 taps in like a swirly like straw, like those crazy straws you have when you're a kid. And it would sort of like, you'd pull one lever down and you'd be turning on 2 taps. It was 2 beers being shot into the same glass at the same time, just for that instantaneous blend, but also the satisfaction of seeing the 2 colors of the beers swirling around each other before they drop into your glass.
So much drama, but it's entertaining as well as flavorful. Can't wait to see what you've come up with for the Firestone Walker Invitational tomorrow. Well, Jos, it's been really fun to talk to you about all of these experiments, but I think that's a great time to bring it to a close and for us to move on to the more social elements of this evening. G&D Chillers engineers are committed to green technology design, whether you're brewing a juicy IPA or a classic West Coast rendition. BSG has a hop solution for that. Think outside the puree box with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Arrived mobile point of sale powers places with personality, and put SS Brewtech's advances to work in your brew house. Just a reminder, your magazine subscription directly supports our ability to bring you this podcast each week. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, and let us know that this content matters to you. Jos, if people want to learn more about Garage Project and also more about Phantasm, where can they learn more about both of those things?
Instagram's the the easy place to
What's the Garage Project Instagram handle?
Just straight Garage Project, as I would say.
You can pronounce it that way,
yeah.
But this is America, and I'm going to pronounce it Garage Project.
Yeah, so just
Garage Project.
Just straight Garage Project. And then, Phantasm, phantasm.nz.nz. Message us, ask questions, get in touch through Instagram. We'll try to get back to you at some point.
Appreciate you talking to me about all of these things: thiols, hops, dramatic beer pours, and all of the rest on this episode. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers, Jamie. It's been great.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.